Right. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another AIRMIC fastTrack webinar session. This session entitled Getting Buy-in for Reporting Risk Across an Organization. My name is Alexander Frost. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at AIRMIC. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for today's session. Just before we kick off, one or two housekeeping points. I think most of you by now are familiar with the LiveStorm system that we've been using for some time at AIRMIC, but if this is your first time to the system, one important point to make is that you will see on the bottom right of your screen a chat function and a question function. If you have questions during the presentation, you can drop them into the questions box, and this means that both I and our speaker today will be able to see them. So don't put them in the chat function. Do please put them in the question function. Second housekeeping point is to let you know that at the end of this session, there will be a pop-up survey that allows you to provide some feedback to us at AIRMIC on the session and on the system, and to our partner and speaker. So please take the time to fill that in. We really need and value the feedback. And also there is an option on that feedback form to request the slides from today's presentation. Finally, I would just remind you all that as this is one of our fast-track webinars, learning webinars, this session is being recorded. So as I say, this session is getting buy-in for reporting risk across an organization. And it's essential to have buy-in for risk reporting to build resilience and improve decision-making. So this session is going to explore practical strategies to make risk reporting relevant, accessible, and valuable to stakeholders at all levels of an organization. And we are happily going to look at some case studies. It's going to demonstrate how linking risk reporting directly to business objectives and using measurable outcomes can transform this function from a compliance exercise into a tool for strategic advantage. And we are very fortunate today to have a partner and speaker from our good friends at Barnett Waddingham. And I would also point out that the learning objectives for this session are that by the end, you will be able to describe the key strategies for getting buy-in, demonstrate how risk reporting improves decision-making and resilience, and integrate risk reporting into organization priorities. So as I say, very happy to be supported today by our friends at Barnett Waddingham and to have Will Scobie, who is Senior Risk and Resilience Consultant at Barnett Waddingham, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is now a part of our other good partners at Howden. Will supports the development of strategy and delivery at Barnett Waddingham's Risk and Resilience Consulting Services, leading on consulting projects with clients and building new partnerships. Will, thank you very much for being here with us this morning. You are very familiar with our community at AIRMIC, and we're happy to welcome you this time to the Fast Track program. So over to you, and I will see you again a little bit later on during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this session. So as Alex said, this is around getting buy-in for reporting risk across an organization. Before we get started, I want to encourage you as much as possible to interact on this. There will be time for questions at the end, but actually I really like it if people ask questions as we go, make comments, and I will try and interact with that as much as possible. I think it just breaks this up a little bit rather than all being sort of me just sort of talking. I think it's good if we get some comments and input from other people. So as Alex said, please put questions in as we go and feel free to add sort of your opinions, and I will keep an eye out for them and try and quite happily go off on tangents. So as Alex said, Barnett Waddingham are partners with AIRMIC. We've worked on a number of projects which I'll talk about later. This is just your standard regulatory slide at the start, just to say that the information that I'm going to share with you should not be taken as advice for investments. And also, as Alex said, I'm Will Scobie. I've been at Barnett Waddingham now for about 4 months, but for the 10 years before that, I was running a consultancy company leading on risk and resilience as managing director. Our clients were primarily in North America and Asia, though we had a number of clients across Europe as well and in the UK. And we were delivering a lot of solutions for them around risk management, business continuity, and crisis management. So, in terms of the agenda for today, we're going to talk initially around strategy integration and some of the main failings we see around risk reporting. I'm going to talk about how we build relationships, how culture and international context comes into it. We're going to talk about emerging risks and some particular work that Barnett Woodingen's been doing with EMIC before closing on some practical tips and some questions. But like I said, please add questions as we go, and I will happily answer them and go off on tangents. So before we start, I wanted to take it a little bit of a step back because I think we as risk professionals and people working in insurance know that our role and the way that we're interacting with senior leadership, how we're reporting risks, has changed substantially in the last few years. I think COVID, as we know, was a real watershed for our industry, both in the failings that it exposed, but also the changing way that leadership are now interacting with risks. If you think going back to 2020, and how we as risk professionals and working in the insurance sector were putting policies together for clients, I think we have to collectively as an industry say that we failed. I certainly feel as a consultant working with some of my clients that I failed to anticipate the breadth and the impact of COVID, especially when it was top of the UK National Risk Register and major organisations were saying how likely this risk would be and the potential for its impact. I can think of times over the 5 years before COVID where I was running pandemic exercises with clients, where I was engaging with leadership around the pandemic risk. But did I push it to the extent of now that we can see how that risk was? But I don't think I did. And I think that is shared across the industry. So what lessons can we learn from that and what changes can we make would be my first sort of overarching point. And the second point is around, I think, the opportunity that gives us, because I think risk has accelerated since that, and certainly our understanding of some of these emerging risks has changed. And I think leadership are engaging with risk in a way they weren't previously. And I was struck by going to, in my previous role, institute directors meetings, even just on a regional basis, and hearing, senior directors or people that were non-executive directors talking about risk and cybersecurity in a way that I hadn't heard them before. And I think that gives us an opportunity to go beyond how we might have approached risk management before. So going into that and riffing off of that theme slightly, I'm sure many of you have seen these terms and engaged with them, but I think they're important to think about how that context of risks has changed for us. So the word polycrisis essentially means you have a number of different crisis events or risks layering on top of each other. And the word permacrisis effectively means that we're going from one crisis to another. And certainly anybody working in risk or business continuity or managing a business between 2020 to 2023 and maybe subsequently will know that it has gone from crisis to crisis, from COVID to energy shocks to supply chain disruption to geopolitical issues. We've had quite a lot of stuff happening, and underlaying that have been ongoing risks such as cybersecurity. So I think these two words for me, I wanted to pull out at the start of this because I think they really underline the operational change in the landscape that we're working in around risk. That business leaders now are having to navigate layered risks in a way that they may not have done in the past and are lurching potentially through no fault of their own in many cases from crisis to crisis. And we need to, as risk professionals, adapt to those changes. So when we talk about strategy integration, I think this is a really important point. I did my MBA a few years ago, and I've known a couple of colleagues working in risk management that have done the same. And it's really interesting to see how the language of risk and the terms that we use don't really enter how business leaders are being trained. Sure, there's modules and discussion of specifically around risk management, but I very much found that when I was being taught around strategy, and when you were looking at the main models around strategy, they weren't really factoring in risk in the way that we would talk about it. Certainly, it's talking about availability of resources, talking about how you can scale the business up and the challenges there. But a lot of the strategy discussion was not factoring in risk. And I think part of that is the way that we talk about risk and the way we interact with leadership. So there's a few points here, and I will give some better examples later on when we talk about emerging risks and the change around that. But I think we've got to be very clear around getting out of risk speak and terminology, talking less about risk appetite and controls and management decisions and likelihood versus impact, and getting into the real world. uh, I guess I'm going to use the word impact, the real world, what would happen if something went wrong. Because I think we need to move risk away from being about the process and actually talking more about risk itself. So I chaired for a couple of years a risk committee at my local authority. In my spare time, I'm a local government councillor, and I chaired our governance and audit committee, and we were responsible for the risk register. And I was surprised how much time was spent on process, on whether we captured the right controls, on whether we had the right risk owners, or whether the score was quite right. I tried to get us as a committee to look really really hard at thinking about the impact and not about the process. And I think that's something that we can all share. I think also linking risk management to values and strategy. My personal view is that increasingly risk management will become a core tenet and is becoming a core tenet of strategy. And so we need to think more broadly about that and linking our risk management in with values and strategy. It's certainly part of best practice that we do that. So I'm sure lots of people in this call are already doing it. But I think there's an extra level in terms of how we could do that. And I think we've got to break out from the shackles of our own models a little bit. And particularly when I come later on to talk about emerging risk, I do think that there are new techniques or techniques that we can use more of, that are in our toolkit, that we're not using at the moment. And this slide, thinking about some of the main failings around risk reporting specifically. These are just some of the things when I was looking through recent projects with clients and thinking about impacts that I've seen. These are some of the main failings. So I won't go through all of them, but big one, lack of understanding around risk. So do people really understand what we're talking about? Lack of support from leadership, lack of resource, different global interpretations of risk. I think all of you in your own way would see some of these have impacted your role either currently or in the past, as to why we failed to get the right risk reporting, why we failed to get leadership to understand the risk properly, or why things have been missed. And again, tying back to COVID-19 and the fact that that was top of the UK National Risk Register, and organisations like the World Health Organization were saying that they saw this as a massive risk. Which of these probably tied into that? And it would be interesting if we have another major risk comes along, like COVID-19, like if we go back 10 years before, Icelandic volcanoes, which downed air traffic in 2009, 2010. Again, that was UK, that top of the UK National Risk Register. We've had this happen consistently, where major risks are there, but as risk professionals, we've either been unable or unwilling to engage them properly, and some of these may be the reasons behind that. So how can we start to improve risk reporting and getting more buy-in for risk reporting? So for me, this is about building and fostering those relationships. And we all know there's a need for sponsorship, but I would say, and I'm sure others on this call would agree, this isn't just about getting your line manager to agree. It's about building a coalition. It's about building that engagement from a wider group of people. And there's some key functions that need to be included. So in pretty much every organization, you're going to need finance, IT, governance, company secretary, comms, operations. Um, Health and safety for a manufacturing business, food safety for anybody working in the food and drink are absolutely critical to getting success for your risk. But you've got to look to build that cross community of risk owners and risk managers. And I'm sure I'm talking to people who are working in the sector and do this already, but you'd be surprised how many times you go into an organization and the person leading risk has just become a compliance person pushed to the side, or is struggling to get ownership of risks by leadership. And there's a few groups that can help on this. we've had a lot of success working with insurers, and Barnett Wooding in my company has recently been bought by Howden, so we're working directly with a lot of brokers, but they can be massive drivers for change. A lot of the changes I've seen from a business continuity perspective in the last 10 years, particularly for mid-market or SME clients, has been driven by the insurance sector. When we had a hard insurance market, and you had underwriters being able to choose who they would insure and be much more competitive and pushing on terms, you saw underwriters requiring businesses to have good business continuity in place. You had underwriters requesting more information around the testing regime for plans, for putting in ERM frameworks, and that was a real pattern of behavior. Now we're in a softer insurance market at the moment, but I can still see that there's a push there. And as things sort of change over the next few years, I'm sure that insurers and brokers will be big change drivers in terms of risk behaviour. International standards are the same. The British Standards Institute, the BSI, have included risk management in a lot more of their standards. So 9001 being an example of where risk management is now being captured. And it looks like they're doing the same with organisational resilience as well. So those international standards can also be a big driver in your organization. So if you're a risk manager and you're thinking about how you can get better buy-in, and you know that you are certified to any of the standards, that could be a good partnership to build, because those people could be incredibly helpful if a renewal for your certification is coming up and there's more work needs to be done around risk management. They might have areas of leadership that you don't. So it's good to sort of build partnerships with them. Same with insurers and brokers. And of course, customer audits and the increasing focus on cyber assurance are also big change drivers. So if people are focusing on cybersecurity and building out good processes, if you have a feeling that the cyber maturity is higher than the risk maturity for the wider organization, then look to partner up and see how you can build your processes. The best organizations I've seen with plans and process around this is where you have the overarching framework and lots of different things tie off of it. So if you had, for example, an ERM framework and you had business continuity, cybersecurity, IT resilience, crisis communications, food safety, all coming off of that, that's far better than having an escalation process for cybersecurity, an escalation process for a reputational issue, and then potentially a food safety process. If you can bring those together, great. And if one of those is more mature than the others, then build the less mature processes around that more mature process to make sure that there's that single approach. Now, I think an important aspect to this is obviously going to be culture, but also the international context. So I said at the start that a lot of the clients I was working with were international, and that really changes the focus on risk. One of my major clients for 10 years was a large US manufacturing client, and they had sites all around the world. And they had their top 100 key and critical locations, which we as consultants were coming in to support. And we traveled to a lot of those sites, and it was quite interesting just to see the variety of cultures from a site in South Korea or in India or Australia or North America or Brazil and Europe. And they actually had data to track that, and some of the different perspectives around risk and reporting, which I'll come on to in a bit. But it's given me quite a, as well as working with other clients, quite an interesting overview. So just before we go on, I've had a question from Darren Anderson asking around how cross-functional meetings and forums work, and how, if there's any advice for sharing knowledge and appreciation of shared risks among the relevant functions within a business. So thanks for the question, Darren. I've seen them work really, really well at an operational level. So it's definitely bringing together, particularly in a manufacturing business, everything that could do with stopping production and the risks associated with that, whether it's from third parties, power utilities, people. Having really good focus on that has brought a lot of benefits, and I think there's a shared sort of push there. I think it is harder at a leadership level, because I think I use the word politics here. Organizational politics sometimes come in, that people own risk, and people can sometimes be a bit cagey. So my main sort of advice for approaching those situations is to get people out of the process. So if you talk about impact and tolerance around risk, I think it gets people talking about, well, scoring, and sometimes people can be a bit cagey. If you talk scenarios, even at an early stage, if you're starting out on a process and you want to build a risk register or engage people in risk, I think scenarios are so key. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but it's a good question. And maybe some others want to put in the chat some examples where you've had of really, really doing this well of getting that sort of cross-functional basis going. So coming back to culture and international context then, um, I think culture can be such a key thing, and the founders or anybody who's been long serving on the C-suite can influence risk culture massively. And I can give you some examples. I'm sure we've all heard them. You know, you hear from leadership, oh, we tried that 20 years ago and it didn't work, so it's not an issue. Or you have somebody saying, oh, you know, it's a very sort of Texan. I used to have a business partner in Texas, and he would always say, as Texans, you know, we're 10 feet high and bulletproof. So that if you've got a character in the C-suite that has that attitude, that can be really sort of influential around business culture. But also the other way, we've worked with founders of business that are terrified of anything happening to their company, their baby, and so they take a very sort of different approach to risk. So I think understanding those people and engaging them can be key to driving and influencing risk culture. Of course, risk appetite is critical. We all know that. But I think that next point around best practice may be the goal, but you've got to start somewhere. I see so many people starting a project around risk management or business continuity or resilience, and they're saying, well, this is what the ISO says, or this is what the Business Continuity Institute or the IRM say is best practice. When the reality is you've got to start somewhere, and that's where a lot of the work that I would do as a consultant would be coming in to break the logjam. And sometimes you do need that external person to come in and take the sort of the politics out of it. But I would say you just got to find an in. And like I said to the point I was saying to Darren, sometimes that in is just to get people talking about risk and scenarios. And that doesn't have to be an exercise again that we would think from, you know, the full sort of compliance perspective. You know, you have your objectives, you do this. It might just be a 10-minute initial conversation at a leadership meeting or a staff meeting saying, okay, this went wrong last month. How are we going to make sure that doesn't happen again? Or I'm worried about this, or I saw this with a competitor, or this was in the news today. How can we as a group discuss this and work out how we can make sure this doesn't happen again? So you've got to start somewhere, and you may have an ERM framework as your goal. You may have risk registers for all the key functions. You may have a full business continuity plan as your goal, but you have to start somewhere. I think it's also important to talk at this stage when we're talking culture around disinformation and misinformation, because I think that has become not just a disruptor for a number of other risks, but actually a risk in itself. Because the more sort of we learn about risk, the more we sort of share information, the more opportunity there is for um, issues to come up where that blurs the lines. And without going into the wider issue, you can see that at the moment with what's happened in Venezuela and Greenland, which is geopolitics way above sort of the risk that I want to talk today. But you know, we can't even agree whether the risk is either. The risk is that, you know, this imminent that both of these countries are going to be threatening, you know, other sort of organizations or countries, or there isn't a risk, and that, you know, this is being blown up or expanded for a reason. We don't know what the truth is. Some people, I certainly have my views, and I'm sure our people on this call do, but if we can't agree the facts around what a risk is, that starts to undermine that, and we've got to make sure that doesn't come into culture. And it may well be there to an extent, and I certainly know from working with some American organizations and even going to some of the risk organizations across the US, without wanting to focus on them, because I'm sure there's issues elsewhere as well. The pushback on ESG, the pushback on climate risk has been quite eye opening. in terms of how that's changing. So things that 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I would have taken as read that we could all agree that climate risks are going up for a particular reason. Suddenly, that basis of fact may not be there, and you should be aware of that, and that is there in an international context. And thinking around local risk in an international context. So we talked about some of these different countries will have different risks and tolerances. I've got another slide in a second, which I think will actually show how even within communities within a country can have that. But I think you've also got to be mindful of who you're talking to and how their risk perspective might be different. So an example of this, so in my spare time, I'm quite involved in my local community, and I sit on the River Stour internal drainage board in Kent. If you don't know what a drainage board is, I don't blame you. um, they're all around. It's a mixture of local government councillors and elected farmers, basically coming together to look after the waterways. So the Environment Agency looks after the main waterways, but the number of sort of tributaries and smaller sort of waterways that need to be looked after. And the drainage boards do them. They're not everywhere in the country, but they cover quite a lot of the area. So I sit on that board, and so I have a lot of conversations over the last 3 years about clearing our riverways. Making sure there's no debris, cutting back on the weeds that are there. So I was very lucky a year ago to be invited on a UK government trade mission to India as part of their climate adaptation and resilience team. Amazing opportunity. But while I was there, I was talking to a couple of representatives in Chennai, I think it was, around their sort of work to dredge and clear their rivers. And it was I'm bringing this up. There is a purpose to this story. I apologize. Um, they were talking about how difficult they find it to clear their waterways. And it was the comment that they made really opened my eyes. They said, because of course, before we can clear our waterways and get our dredging equipment in, we have to clear the waterway of crocodiles. Now, that was a real eye opener for me, because the worst sort of wildlife we have to deal with in Kent, England, is the beaver population, or potentially aquatic snails, or any sort of nesting birds that we have to be aware of. That sort of eye opener of somebody doing the same job for the same reasons in a different country, but their risk is so different. You can't just send volunteers in to go and start cutting things back manually or to go and assess it, because there's crocodiles. Of course there are. And so I bring that up just as slightly sort of more on the light-hearted side, but to say that as we think about risks in Europe, or we think about risks in our respective sort of countries, or industries, you need to think about how that risk is being interpreted elsewhere. And just on my next slide, I just want to give a little bit of examples. I don't know how easy this will be to see. When I had it on my large screen when I was preparing the slides, I thought, oh, this is great. I think it's going to be a bit too small to properly see, but I will talk people through it. So this is from an organization called the American Communities Project, which has broken the US into small counties, and then they've done a load of work in terms of trying to build a picture of what America looks like. And when I was trying to visualize, for me, the variances in risk between countries, and even within sort of here you'll see even within states, um, I thought this was a really good visualization. So I'll talk you through it again. You may not be able to see it all. The top left diagram is around heat stress. So the area in red, which is in the middle, which is Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, that area is the bit that's being hit the most by high sort of temperatures, and the communities there are really struggling with heat stress. The areas that are green are not impacted this on a low sort of level. You can see there's a bit of a tip down at the bottom right in Florida, but you can see that the major area impact is in the middle of the country. So if we move across to the right, this is the risk of extreme rainfall. So again, sort of the green areas are not really impacted, but you can see that this is slightly different. The rainfall impact is coming majorly out in West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, a little bit of Pennsylvania, and in the Northwest in Washington. And so these are the areas being impacted by effectively large-scale flooding. If we then move to the bottom left, this is the opposite of that. This is water stress, so not having enough water. And you can see it's a wholly different region. You've got parts of Utah and New Mexico, Arizona, Canada, bits of Texas, going up again into Iowa and Missouri, Nebraska. But it's a different region. And then finally, bottom right, we have hurricane and typhoon. So the purple area basically means no impact. And as I'm sure you will see from, happens every year, you can see that Florida, Louisiana, North and South Carolina are impacted by annual hurricanes and typhoons. So I wanted to put these up because it shows even within a country, these four major risks are impacting almost completely different regions, whether it's heat stress, center of the country, extreme rainfall, the northeast and the northwest of the country. You have water stress, more the southwest of the country, and hurricanes and typhoon, the southeast of the country. So even you thinking about, oh, we've got a site in the US, I wonder what risks impact them. The question you should be asking is, where are they based? Because the risk will be slightly different. I've linked to this study from the American Communities Project in my slides. So when they get sent around, you can have a look at them. But I found these really, really interesting. So talking emerging risks for a little bit then. So what do we mean by emerging risks? So emerging is quite a common word. People usually put it before a risk if they think it's relevant. There isn't really a standardization around how organizations are labeling emerging risk. And so that means that each organization should really establish their own rules around this. But I think the most common feature of this is that people use the term emerging when it's a new risk or it's an established risk that's being used in a new context, but which is poorly understood. So I really think that as we've sort of changed things from COVID, and that's changed the way that we talk about risk, and as I said before, the way that leadership are now engaging in risk, I think that the nature of risk has changed, the way we're talking about it has changed, and therefore our models, tools, and terminology needs to change with that. And this is the guide that Barnett Wadding was actually written with AMIC, which is around emerging risks themselves. It's a practical guide. You can download it from the website if you're an AMIC member. And the reason I think this is important, as with this quote, is that the challenge is that with an emerging risk, you don't necessarily have the ability to gain the data or translate that information and apply that information. And you can't easily get to a point where you can claim to have strategic insight or strategic intelligence. And this is where I think our core tools as risk managers, the main way that we articulate and regulate risk, needs to change, because we are claiming that we can properly quantify risks that, let's be honest, we can't. We do not know necessarily what the impact of artificial intelligence is going to be on our operations. We don't necessarily know how the innovations in cybersecurity are going to impact our organizations. We don't necessarily know how climate risk or the geopolitical impact of Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin or the ongoing changes that China is making in their region are going to impact us. We can certainly infer quite a bit out of that, but can we rightfully claim to have strategic insight or strategic intelligence on that? I am not sure. And I think by saying that we can score it on a 1 to 5 impact and a 1 to 5 likelihood, I think opens us up to problems in the future where we may have another Icelandic volcanoes or another COVID-19 situation where foreseeable risks have not been captured in our own risk registers, or that we have overstated other risks and the potential impact that they could have. And so what do we mean by changing the language on this? What do I mean by we need to adapt our terminology? So a couple of simple things. Instead of impact and likelihood, let's talk about consequences and plausibility. So rather than saying, do we know what the impact is on a score of 1 to 5, talk about, do we know what the consequence of that would be? So do we know what an impact of AI is going to be on your operations if you're a manufacturing business? No, you can't quantify that because you don't know, and it's going to change. You could have different scenarios, but you won't know. Do we know what the consequence of that would be? Well, there you might have a better conversation and be able to capture some insights. Similarly, on likelihood and plausibility, likelihood in this situation with some of these emerging risks is very, very difficult to nail down. It's very, very difficult to say, yes, that's a 3 or that's a 4. Even if you've got a really mature understanding of likelihood and you've got a good system for how you put that, some of these emerging risks are so ethereal you can't really talk about likelihood. That's where plausibility comes in. Is it a plausible scenario? Is it a plausible risk that this could happen? And I think you'll find that it's a better situation to talk about those risks. And similarly, how we're talking about the output of that. So instead of assess and respond, we're talking about monitor and adapt. So assessing gives you an idea that you can quantify it, that you can measure it, when the reality is that, again, with some of these risks, you really can't. So it becomes more about monitoring. So we talked about consequence and plausibility. Let's monitor it. And again, with responding again seems to imply that there'll be a trigger point where that risk will materialize and you're responding to it, or that there are direct impacts now. Some of these emerging risks could be slow burn and never really impact you. If you think about one that was really sort of on a lot of people's mind, it was around space debris. And so the risks there, and I remember going out to the a risk conference in the US and talking, hearing lots of talk about space debris. This idea that there's so much debris in space, and particularly with states like China blowing up satellites and creating more debris, that soon you might be in a position where it will be very, very difficult to launch new satellites. And you think about the impact of that would be that then you've got a growing demand for GPS technology or for satellite technology, or even to use satellite for internet, like with Elon Musk's enterprise. You then sort of take that to the next point and you go, well, that could lead to a decay in the capability, or at least an inability for aging tech to be able to keep up with the new demands of technology. So what impact does that mean for organizations? Now, there may be people on this call who have assessed that risk and do understand how they impact their business, and I completely respect that. But if I think about the clients that I'm working with, and think about it for a lot of organizations, I struggle to see how you would know with any certainty how that risk would impact you. But if you're not talking about it, if you're not flagging it up to leadership, how are you going to be making sure you're doing your job? So that's where this would come in as a different way of talking about these risks. Because in that situation, you could say, okay, what would be the consequence of space dust on us? Would it mean that we would have to alter the way we're doing logistics for our products? Would we have to change the way that we're tracking the safety of our staff when they're working off-site? Okay, so that would be a way of capturing consequences. Plausibility, is it plausible? You'd say at the moment, probably not, that impact would be. But then if you are monitoring it over time, you can then say what would be the triggers to make that a plausible risk that we then may then start to look more into, and what adaptations would we have to make as a business to cover that. So this is where the change would come in for those risks. I'm not suggesting for a second that you would need to change our more traditional established risks, things like fire, flood, even cyber attack, which I think can probably come both sides of this, because there are emerging risks within the cyber sort of bucket that may benefit from going through a more emerging risk change. But I think this is where our language needs to change. And I think this will help us to make more robust decisions. Um, I'm just going to pause for a second to see if I haven't seen any other questions pop up, and just say to people, if there is anything, particularly with this emerging risk thing, with this idea, if there are any questions that you've got or any comments, I'd love to hear from them around how people have used emerging risk or talked about emerging risk with their leadership, or potentially um, any challenges you might have, any questions you might have for others in terms of how that's worked. I think it's one of those things we're all a little bit in the same boat here of wanting to make some changes in this area, so to open ourselves up, but we're all working in the same sense with the same challenges. And that's why sessions like this are really important for us to share information. If anybody does have any thoughts, please share them. And just another sort of quote from the guide, because that really struck me, because the alternative is it's very common to find organizations are investing heavily in risk management, but really underutilizing the value of their risk management activities and decision making. This, I think, gets to the nub of why we're trying to run a session like this around getting better buy-in for risk reporting across an organization. Because how many people are working in their area, doing lots of great work, analyzing all of this, and just can't get the engagement from leadership? And some of that is about us potentially building better coalitions, dealing with the internal politics better, but some of that is also about us adapting to the new reality. So I want to talk about some practical tips. And I probably covered some of this, but there are two other guides that Barnett Woodingham and ERMIC have jointly written, one around scenario analysis and one around horizon scanning. And I think these are two critical pieces of how we can change the way that we are operating as risk managers, as business continuity managers, as underwriters, as brokers, and engaging with the topic of risk. Because we have to start using different tools, and these tools are still part of it. This isn't anything revolutionary to say, oh, we need to do scenario analysis. I'm sure lots of you already do that, but I would say that pretty much with all of the clients I work with, particularly in the mid-market and SME space, their go-to is to have a risk register and tick, we're done. If you look at someone's annual report of a larger business who might be listed, what do they say? We have a risk register, these are our risks, tick. Is that really enough? Is that really where we want the starting point to be for our industry? Now, I know everyone on this call will probably have the same view. Of course, that's not enough. It's a starting point. But I would argue that a starting point should be now to do scenario analysis and horizon scanning. I'm not saying chuck the risk register out the window, but if you only get an hour with leadership a quarter at a risk committee or to present at a board meeting, we should be using scenario analysis and going through what risks are on the horizon, rather than engaging them with what's on the risk register and what the scoring is. That's important, but maybe you could split it up, that if you get 4 opportunities a year to report to a risk committee, why not use 2 of those to go through a scenario, one of them for a horizon scan, and just one to report on the risk register? Or try and make the risk register an email or a communication that's sent out in advance, so you don't spend a lot of time talking, well, is this the right score, is that the right control? You need to get leadership talking about risk, not the process of risk. And then those practical tips around using the right terminology for emerging risk, I think that will really help a lot of people if we are going to do that. So I've talked about the 3 emerging risk, horizon scanning, and scenario analysis. Sorry, I'm just need to put my teeth back in. Guides that Barnett, Woodingham, and ERMIC have written together. Here they are. They're available on the website. There's some really good stuff in there. They are described as practical guides. I would say that there are certainly practical elements of that, but they are quite they're very well researched and quite detailed guides. You're sort of talking 20, 30 pages. So if you're thinking about looking at them, make sure you've got time to go through it, or you may need to come back to elements of it. They're quite deep dives, and the practical elements are clearly there. But this isn't something you can pick up, have a quick read from, and put away. They're very sort of in-depth documents, and I think that's what's needed in this space to start to layer some detail there. And just if you are interested in getting more information, obviously you're ERMIC members, so you have a wealth of information coming your way. But as Barnett Woodingham, as Howden, we also have our own risk portal. There are 3 levels of membership for that. There is a free sort of level where you can get some help, self-help sort of resources. There's a more in-depth one. and then there's the access to the whole sort of portal. This is where we've tried to pull together resources for our clients to answer some of those questions you might be having, or create guides or toolkits or checklists for various things. If you're a risk manager and you're concerned around staying up to date and you haven't got a lot of budget, this is a great way of just staying in depth. And we're always refreshing the content. We've got a real big push over the next 12, 18 months to bring a lot of the Howden information into it. Barnett Waddingham over the last sort of years been purchased by Howden, so there's an opportunity for us to bring all that knowledge in. So if you join now, you're about to get access to huge amounts of stuff, which I think will be really beneficial. But that is the main sort of thrust of the presentation. I think Alex is about to come back in. He's, I think, got some questions for me, and this is an opportunity, if you've got any questions, to really ask them. Hopefully you've enjoyed that sort of whistle-stop tour around risk reporting and emerging risk and some of those other topics. But yeah, thank you very much for listening, and more than happy to answer any questions. Welcome back, Alex.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Will, and thank you to Barnett Waddingham, and by extension to Howden. I think that was a wonderful overview of one of the most important aspects of how we manage risk and how risk slots into corporate life and corporate culture. I have a question just before I go to any from the audience, which is, you mentioned several times in your presentation the SME sector and the mid-market, which of course is something that we are increasingly aware of wanting to do more with here at AIRMIC. One of the things that I feel defines a mid-market risk manager is that, as opposed to some of our large corporate members and organizations, they don't always, or often don't have, a large dedicated risk function, somebody who is a head of risk or a head of insurance. The risk function is really handled off the side of the desk of somebody else, whether that's the head of finance or someone in internal audit, or maybe the CFO, or and so they don't necessarily speak the same language of risk as other risk professionals. They're not really sure. They often maybe don't have a risk management function other than the buying of insurance. And I just wonder if you could talk to us for a few minutes, Will, having worked with that sector. There may be some of those members on the call who are in similar situations, how you go about getting buy-in for building a risk management function and a risk reporting system if you're in that kind of structure.
Absolutely. No, it's a great question. And I think there's a lot of concern in various sectors around sort of how SMEs and sort of mid-market clients are dealing with risk, because a lot of the clients I work with, so the company I used to work for were specialist partners with Aviva. So we used to do all of the business continuity planning for their clients. So we would work with dozens of sort of SMEs. And there were a number of sort of learnings that came out from that. Is, number one, they're usually having to do this because they've been told to by a customer, by an insurer, or they've had something go wrong and they're really worried about that. So the drive for this is not to have something that's best practice and to get an ISO or to meet regulatory requirements. This is usually because they have to, and there isn't really the time and resource for that. And so that sort of changes the nature of how they approach it. The second thing that I take from that is this is a really important issue for all companies. So we may have some SMEs on the call, but most of the companies will be any sort of organization in the UK is reliant on these small companies for lots of different things, whether it's outsourced services or parts or machinery, etc., for your products. And the gap in maturity is quite huge. And if I looked at cyber risk, it's just one risk, Alex. People are pushing more and more compliance down the supply chain. You need to have cyber essentials. You need to be 27001. You need to go through this audit. You need to sign this contract that means that you will meet all of these different things. The investment's not there. There's a really sort of fascinating study that Make UK do every year. So Make UK is the main sort of manufacturing organization for sort of a membership organization for manufacturers in the UK. And they do like an annual review of their members. And the thing that comes out is they talk about how I can't, I'm off the top of my head, I'm not going to pretend that I know the exact figures, but it's something like 90% of their members are worried about supply chain risk and the pressures that are being put on them. But only less than 10% of them are actually going to do anything about it because they just haven't got the money in the budget.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you that it's a risk. In terms of solutions, I think the key thing is to make the tools available to them and to build partnerships with those larger companies that are their customers. Because if I think about the work that I was doing for the US manufacturer that I mentioned earlier in their 100 key and critical location around the world, they were reliant on thousands. I think their total supplier base was 16, 17,000 suppliers. And we went and visited a number of those suppliers, and they really wanted to do the right thing for their client because they wanted to get more work out of them. They wanted to continue to be a customer for them. So when the client said, "Oh, can you put risk registers in place? Can you have a BCP? Can you meet this cybersecurity requirement?" They said yes. But the more that the larger business helped them, the better the process ran, because then they didn't need to go off and create something on AI or pull in, a one-man band consultancy, not to talk them down, but somebody to do a quick and sort of easy solution. They're then able to repeat all of the knowledge from their client and work from that. So I think the key thing is partnership. Make this not a compliance issue with SMEs in your supply chain. Make this not a, beating people over the head. Make this a partnership and share that knowledge and understanding. If you're mature in your risk and you're worried about your suppliers, then share that knowledge down the chain.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate that. The other side of the equation I've heard, Will, is that obviously those sorts of organizations are also heavily reliant on their broker, their insurance partners, people like Howden, to provide that expertise. And I would have thought that they would have said, well, of course, I want them to come to me with all those questions. But what they've also said they want is, they want increasing maturity of how organizations handle risk, because it makes it easier for them to recommend strategies and easier for them to build solutions that actually meet those needs. So I think partnership, you mentioned there, is the key word. And I also find it interesting in the mid-market, at least, that a mid-market firm can be anything up to £1 billion turnover, depending on who you're talking to. Some of these very big, very sophisticated organizations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. So we have a question. Thank you for taking the time to answer mine. We have a question from the audience, which is, you spoke earlier about linking to strategy. Could you give some examples of what it could look like if you've linked engagement with the C-suite to get their attention? Obviously 5 minutes on the board agenda before lunchtime to talk about risk management is difficult. How do you really get them to get buy-in? Do you have a case study maybe that could illustrate that for us?
Yeah, I've got a couple that come to mind, one with sort of a larger organization, one with a smaller one. So I can start with the smaller one just because it riffs off of what we were saying. We were brought in by a food manufacturer based in the southeast to write a plan for them. And the plan we were being asked to write was very operational. It was around loss of utilities to the site, loss of, refrigeration, those sorts of risks. And an example of where I think we as risk managers can break out of that is the first interview I always do for any sort of engagement with a client is to try and talk to the most senior people and understand the risks that the business is having. And I've got an opportunity to meet with the managing director of the business and interview him for an hour. Now, the first 20 minutes was me talking to him about loss of refrigeration, loss of this. He obviously engaged in it, but he was giving very much, you need to talk to that person, you need to talk to that. It wasn't until I said to him, so, what are the things that are worrying you from a strategy perspective? It opened up a whole other thing, that he was actually worried about the total loss of site and how he could replicate that. And he was actually talking strategically about opening a site in the Benelux countries so that he had a base in Europe to potentially start opening up that market, and that he would have a place to move production to if he lost his site. Now, if I hadn't have had that wider conversation, asked him about his strategy, I wouldn't have been able to link the two. And the fact that the work that we were doing around, looking at the potential ways that production could be lost from an operational level, linked in with his strategic concern, they were the same, and it actually made the project run a lot better. So that's one example from a smaller client, and just with a larger client, and this one's a little bit more sort of I can't think what the right word is, but I'll explain it and then you'll see what I mean. We had a client that who were a major sort of port infrastructure provider along sort of the coast of the UK. And they did a load of investment in their sort of resilience planning and risk management. And the business itself was getting ready for sale. And it was interesting that we managed to get the language of resilience into the sale of the business. And they started marketing themselves as one of the most resilient ports in the UK and Europe, because they'd done all this investment. They were able to embrace that, and it became part of their strategy and a major selling point for the business that they'd done this investment. So I think looking at ways that you can build that language in are really, really critical. And I always go in with businesses I work with to try and get them to not just invest in risk management and resilience, but then make it part of their marketing to clients. Be able to turn around to clients and say, we're great on price, you've got good customer service. Oh, and by the way, if anything ever went wrong, we've got great plans, we know how to handle risk, and we will guarantee you, much more than our competitors, much more than other people, that we will get your products and we will get your services delivered if anything goes wrong. And that could be a real selling point in a polycrisis, permacrisis world.
There's a real commercial aspect then, isn't there? I mean, you're not just preventing loss, you're supporting the value and you're supporting the growth of the business, because you're burnishing the credentials and the reputation of the organization, which makes you a safer bet for investment.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's something that in the risk management community we should be talking about a lot more. How we support the value of the organization rather than being the department that says no.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the changing things. And if you look at, I think finance is in a similar sort of way. If you see how finance professionals are being trained now, they're being trained that most of the classic bookkeeping process are now automated, and so finance professionals are now being trained to be information givers and analysis makers within the organization to help leaders make better decisions. So that idea of finance being can't afford it, no budget, computer says no, is actually now becoming, do you know that you've got this much money left in your budget and these are some of the things you could spend on? Or did you know that if you're able to increase your sales by 2%, you'll have this additional money, which means that then we can do this strategic engagement. And I would love to see risk professionals. I know AIRMIC and the IRM are pushing quite a lot in this space already, but I'd love for us as risk professionals to really push ourselves as well to say, we need to be more engaging and more positive. As you said, stop being the people that say no.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think we'll be doing a lot more of that at AIRMIC, how to communicate the value of risk management in weeks and months to come. Well, we don't have any more questions from the audience, and we're 2.5 minutes from time. So I think at this stage, it falls to me to thank you very much, to thank Barnett Waddingham and Howden very much for giving this session. I think if my colleague Amelia is in the background, Amelia, now would be a good time for the survey to come up. As I said at the beginning, this feedback survey is incredibly valuable to us at AIRMIC and to our partners. So please answer it if you have time. And also, should you have any further questions for Will or for Barnett Waddingham that occur to you later, you can always get in touch with us. So you can always find the Barnett Waddingham contact details, which you can see there on the screen, but they're also available on the AIRMIC website in the partner directory. So thank you, all of you, for coming to today's session. And thank you, Will. I hope we'll see you back here again at AIRMIC very, very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.